Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Barsanti. I'm the Edwin Wolf II Director of the Library Company, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you again to our Fireside Chat series. Tonight is our last Fireside Chat of 2021, and for this special occasion, we have Devin Leigh joining us to talk about his latest research and his latest book, which called The Origins of an Archive. This is a fantastic story about two men, two enslavers, and their parallel paths that they follow in the late 18th century. I want to thank all of you for coming tonight and for joining us for Devin's talk. Tonight's talk is the way tonight's talk is working, it's being presented as a webinar. So as we're talking to you, we can't actually see your faces. We can't see you out there. And so if you have questions, I'd urge you to put them into the Q&A that's down there at the bottom of your screen. Use the Q&A function. We will be doing a short Q&A at the end of the presentation tonight. You can also use the chat, but we'll be looking more at the Q&A for your questions. Fireside Chat series is a program that we started at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic as a way of giving our scholars and scholars from scholars working in the period of the 18th and 19th century American history to communicate with each other and also to share their work with a broader public. And it's given us a chance to feature the work of some of the most interesting scholars, both our fellows and some folks who aren't fellows yet. So tonight is no exception. We're really glad to have Devin Nunes here. I'm Devin Nunes. I don't know where that came from. I'm so sorry. That was a weird, strange cross-wiring that happened in my head. That happens at this time of night sometimes.
He's been in the news lately, so maybe it's
that's terrible. I'm so sorry.
It's in the recording.
Devin Leigh.
It's in the recording now, so it's permanent.
It's permanent. It's transcribed. I'm so sorry, Devin.
No, that's fine.
Try again. Devin Leigh. Devin Leigh, L-E-I-G-H, Leigh.
Perfect.
Recently obtained a PhD in history from the University of California, Davis, and he is currently working as a lecturer in the history department at San Francisco State. His research focuses on the early modern Atlantic world, and he writes mostly about connections between Great Britain, West Africa, and the West Indies in the late 18th century. His work has been supported by such institutions as the Eccles Centre for American Studies at the British Library and the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. It has recently appeared in such journals as New West Indian Guide, History in Africa, and the Journal of Caribbean History. He is an avid listener of the Library Company's Fireside Chat series. They do get edited sometimes. I think we're going to need to edit this one. I'm so embarrassed, Devin. Please forgive me someday for this.
It's fine. It makes it unique. Character of its own. That's good.
And at least up until a few minutes ago, he was grateful to be one of its presenters. Anyway, Devin Leigh, thank you. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to hearing about the origins of an archive, Enslavers and the Geopolitics of Knowledge Production in an Age of Abolition. And without gross errors, I am now going to back away into the corner.
Thanks, Mike. I'm very excited to be able to be here today and to speak with you about my dissertation. Mike mentioned a minute ago that it was a book, but it's just a dissertation at this point. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the organizers of the Library Company Fireside Chat series for the opportunity to present today, especially Will Fenton, who originally booked me to speak, and then Deja Brock, Fran Dolan, and Blanche Brown, whom I've spoke with at various times over the past couple of months. And then I'd also like to thank everyone in the audience for coming. I really appreciate you being here today. I know that we have a lot of demands on our time and attention, and so I appreciate your time. As far as the presentation will go from here, I'll talk for the next 40 minutes, and then we can do a Q&A discussion with the remaining time that we have on the hour with anything that interests you. Okay, here we go. On Friday, February 7th, 1788. Enslavers from across the British Empire gathered here in the main dining hall of the London Tavern on Bishopsgate Street. They met as a standing committee of their principal lobbyist group, called the Society of West India Planters and Merchants, and the day's roster is shown here on the right. This name was a testament not just to how they viewed themselves, but also to how most people in the metropole had viewed them since the origins of the first British Empire in the middle of the 16th century. The name emphasized their identities based in agriculture and commerce, as productive and patriotic servants of the empire. These were not slave owners, they were planters. They were not slave traders, they were merchants. And yet all of that was beginning to change. Over the past 2 decades, and especially over the past 5 years, more and more people in Great Britain had begun to think of planters and merchants as being part of a common class of people whom they now characterize as enslavers. As a class, this group of Britons was increasingly depicted as backward, as violent, irrational, and degenerate. They were described as having behaviors and values that did not conform to Britain's future as a nation that would supposedly be based upon the twin ideals of free labor and free trade. Instead, to a growing number of people in Great Britain, enslavers were now outsiders. They were others. They were different, maybe not even British at all. Enslavers were shocked. They had just received word that on Monday, in 3 days from this meeting, the Crown was going to announce the empire's first official investigation into the morality and the economics of the transatlantic slave trade. Their meeting at the London Tavern was actually an emergency meeting, hastily organized in order to take into consideration, as they described it, the present application to Parliament on the subject of Negroes. As all those who were in attendance understood, Parliament's decision had been prompted by the agitation of the country's abolitionists, whose new society, the London Abolitionist Society, was headquartered just a short walk away from the tavern at 2 George Yard. From there, on the top floor of a Quaker's printing shop, the abolitionists were then busy editing, publishing, and distributing polemical texts. Texts like Anthony Benezet's An Historical Account of Guinea, a survey of the West African coast, which represented British enslavers as moral degenerates and as a source of the nation's shame and embarrassment. How could this have happened, enslavers wondered? How could Britons be this foolish? For over 2 centuries, enslavers had helped to build the British Empire. Whether they were working out of their estates in the West Indies, their forts in West Africa, or their counting houses right here in Cornhill Ward, London, they had always acted in the interests of the empire. They had remained loyal, even as many of their contemporaries in the 13 colonies of North America waged a war against the crown. Yes, they had participated in slavery, but they had always been encouraged to do that. John Hawkins, the nation's first slave trader, was welcomed home to the metropole by Queen Elizabeth as a national hero. Hans Sloane, Britain's most revered scientist just a generation ago, had risen to prominence even though he owned enslaved people in Jamaica. Parliament literally financed the African Company, the Royal Navy actively suppressed slave resistance, and one of the largest slaveholders in the West Indies was none other than the Anglican Church. Every one of Britain's rivals, European rivals, and now also the United States of America, sanctioned racial slavery and traded in enslaved people. Slavery was approved of by respected sources of ancient and religious authority, from Aristotle to the Bible, and it was practiced in some form or another by almost all of the non-European peoples whom Europeans had encountered in the greater Atlantic world over the past 3 centuries. As they sat in shock in the dining hall at London Tavern, a place where they had met on so many occasions before, enslavers started thinking about how they should respond. In the words of one prominent slave trader from Liverpool, John Tarleton, they knew that they would somehow have to convince both the government and the public that the empire's participation in the slave trade was founded in humanity and justice to the natives of Africa, and not in blood and a series of fraud, violence, and oppression, as those like Benezet had suggested. In the words of Edward Long, a slave owner from Jamaica, they knew that it was necessary at this time for enslavers to create their own texts that could counteract publications upon the freedom of Negroes in the colonies, written by people whom they claimed were absolutely ignorant or ill-informed of the true state of Africans in their native country or in the British colonies. Building upon these suggestions, enslavers decided that they would lean into their personal experiences overseas. They would strategically develop and then deploy their first-hand knowledge of Atlantic world slave societies, what they characterized in their correspondence as their practical knowledge. They would play off their opponents' ignorance and make what the literary scholar Anthony Pagden has called autoptic or eyewitness claims to authority. This strategy is best revealed by a document that circulated among enslavers in the year following their meeting at the London Tavern. The document pictured here was found among the letters of Robert Norris, a British enslaver and an historian of the Kingdom of Dahomey in what is now part of the West African nation of Benin. The document is titled "A List of Persons Examined by the Privy Council and whose evidence appears to have been given from long residence or practical knowledge." The three columns which are shown here list pro-slavery and anti-slavery witnesses who testified before Parliament in the first year of the slave trade debate. Witnesses are ranked according to the extent that they can claim to have practical experience in Africa. Enslavers are characterized as having a wealth of this experience. Norris, for example, is described as having made 5 voyages to the coast of Africa as captain of a slave ship, as having been on several voyages as a surgeon, and also as having lived ashore most of the whole time that he was in Africa. By contrast, abolitionists are represented as ignorant, as having never been to the continent. The following excerpt transcribed from the document makes this argument more clear. Those who are familiar with the history of British abolition will recognize some of the names featured here. The top 3 names are abolitionists and their anti-slavery witnesses. Thomas Clarkson was never in Africa and merely collected his knowledge by a visit of 2 months at Liverpool and 2 months at Bristol. Similarly, James Ramsay is dismissed with the words, "was never in Africa." John Newton, they concede, had in fact commanded a ship in the African slave trade and had resided in Africa for 19 months. Nonetheless, enslavers disqualified Newton because this experience was so long back that his remarks cannot be said to apply to the present practice of the trade. Likewise, while enslavers acknowledged that yes, Alexander Falconbridge had made 5 voyages as surgeon of a slave ship, they noted that he doesn't appear to have resided in Africa. By comparison, pro-slavery witnesses, like one William Devaney's, had not simply visited the continent, but had resided there as a governor for 12 years. As you'll notice, none of the British Empire's Black abolitionists are listed here, such as Olaudah Equiano and Otuokwano, and we can talk about why that is in the Q&A if you'd like, but essentially, the answer is that the British government barred them from testifying on the basis of their race. And this, in my opinion, reflects a common ethnocentrism that bound even the most ardent political opponents of the early modern era, including the empire's white abolitionists and anti-abolitionists. In following this autoptic or eyewitness argument as a political strategy, enslavers set to work producing an entirely new textual arc, a collection of historical and ethnographic texts on Africa, Africans, and people of African descent. For example, at the very same time that he was in possession of that document, Norris was also in possession of the first political or civil history of a West African country in Britain. Playing off a genre of biographical works that had narrated the lives of great British monarchs, Norris entitled this work Memoirs of the Reign of Bosa Ahadi, King of Dahomey. The title used a local praise name, Bosa Ahadi, for King Tibesu, the 5th king of Dahomey. It was edited by the Anglo-Jamaican enslaver Edward Long, making the work a transatlantic collaboration between West Indian slave owners and West African slave traders. And it highlighted enslavers' superior first-hand knowledge of Africa as they understood it in a number of ways that was both discursive and visual. For example, Norris narrated his journey inland to the royal court of Dahomey at Abomey in the year 1772, and you can see that emphasized on the work's title page to the right. A narration of the author's journey to Abomey, the capital, in which he describes persons not sold to British merchants as brutally sacrificed by the king, is then followed immediately by a pro-slavery essay, a short account of the African slave trade, in which Norris discredits abolitionists as hireling scribblers and praises those who have actually lived in Africa and the West Indian Islands, and so are undoubtedly more competent to declare what they have observed. As the frontispiece to his history, Norris published a map that he drew, actually representing that route to Abomey. This map made the autoptic argument visual, depicting the privileged access that slavers claimed they had to the interior of the continent, that true Africa, which Long had mentioned earlier, a place where no white abolitionist had been to, or at that time could hope to write about. My dissertation, The Origins of an Archive, is a group biography of 5 enslavers who, like Robert Norris, produced historical and ethnographic works on Africa and Africans as part of a political attempt to resist the movement to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. Like Benezet, these writers were participating in what the literary scholar George Ulukos has called the 18th century British debate on Africa. My work traces this cohort of British enslavers from the age of the 7 Years' War in the 1750s and 1760s, a time when Britain was Europe's leading slave trader, when no abolitionist movement yet existed, and when these men were just beginning to migrate from Britain into the Atlantic world, to the start of the French Revolutionary War in the early 1790s, when the abolitionist movement was stalled for a period of about 10 years by a number of contingent factors, notably the French and Haitian revolutions and resistance by the anti-abolitionist lobby. And the last of these 5 enslavers produced their most relevant texts. So you can see those texts here displayed from left to right in the order that they were published. With the exception of the History of Jamaica, which was published by Long in 1774 during the early years of anti-slavery activism in Britain, all of these works were published at the height of the slave trade debates between 1788 and 1793, as their authors were actively collaborating in the pro-slavery lobby. 2 of the works, Long's History of Jamaica and Brian Edwards' History of the British West Indies, were about West Indian colonies. However, they focused at length on the people of African descent who resided there. The other 3 texts that I examined, Norris's memoirs, John Matthews's A Voyage to the River Sierra Leone, and Archibald Diels' The History of Dahomey, were on regions of the West African coast. In a moment, I'm going to give an abbreviated version of this story, one that uses the parallel lives of 2 of these 5 men in order to explore how their works emerged as a product of 3 stages in their lives. The first being their immersion in transatlantic cultures of letters and sciences in their youth. The second being their adaptation to the demands of racial slavery overseas. And then the third being their direct engagement with the threat of abolitionism back at home. Before I do that, however, I'd like to briefly summarize the main argument of the dissertation. The Origins of an Archive uses enslavers to argue that the age of abolition was a turning point in the history of early modern knowledge production. Ever since the beginning of the British Overseas Empire in the 16th century, British enslavers had collaborated with metropolitan chroniclers in order to create new knowledge about the Atlantic world as part of a transatlantic network that scholars have described in various ways. Susan Scott Parrish has characterized it as chains of communication. Londa Scheibinger has called it the European colonial nexus. And Ralph Bauer has described it as a geopolitical hierarchy of knowledge production. Following a model that was formalized by Francis Bacon in the Royal Society, overseas travelers, including enslavers, operated as the informants or collectors for stay-at-home chroniclers and compilers. They would travel overseas and they would harvest or mine, in Bacon's words, raw data about peoples and societies of the Atlantic world for scientists who were living back at home. They would then compile and revise them for publication and circulation in the metropole. This was how knowledge was traditionally produced in the English and, after the Acts of Union in 1707, British Empire. Richard Hakluyt in the 16th century, Samuel Purkis in the 17th century, and Thomas Astley in the early 18th century, to mention just a few well-known examples of imperial chroniclers, had never actually traveled overseas. This was because they didn't have to. Hakluyt had his voyagers, Purkis had his pilgrims, and Astley had his travelers. Foremost among these informants were people whom we now call enslavers. Before the rise of the empire's first abolitionist movement in the decades following the 7 Years' War, enslavers and metropolitan chroniclers were bound together by their shared patriotic commitment to 2 projects: American colonization and African slavery. After the 7 Years' War, and particularly after the American Revolution, imperial administrators began a project of reasserting political authority over the colonies. As part of this movement, metropolitan chroniclers began to turn against enslavers. 2 early examples are the American Quaker Anthony Benezet, already mentioned, and the English clerk Randall Sharp. Although he had never been to Africa, Benezet produced his anti-slavery survey of the continent by citing the travel works of past enslavers against contemporary ones. Sharp undertook this same intellectual project for the West Indian colonies, that is, citing the words of past enslavers in criticism of present ones, though he had never traveled overseas. When British enslavers came together to conceive their autoptic argument in 1788, they were reacting not just to a new humanitarian discourse of anti-slavery, but to the geopolitical dimensions of the abolitionist movement itself. They perceived that they could no longer depend upon metropolitan networks of knowledge production, and so they set themselves to the task of producing an archive of their own and on their own. Premised upon the articulation of autoptic or first-hand claims to knowledge, that archive broke from prior literary conventions and resulted in the production of some of the most remarkable, yet controversial, primary sources that we now have on the early modern history of Africa and African people. I would like to turn for the remainder of this presentation to the example of two of the five men at the center of my research. The first is a white West Indian enslaver named Brian Edwards, pictured on the right, and the second is a white West African enslaver named Archibald Diels, pictured on the left. These men led parallel lives, both born in Britain in the early 1740s and raised there until the late 1750s and the early 1760s, when they migrated overseas and became enslavers during the 7 Years' War. They each returned to Britain later in life, joined the anti-abolitionist lobby, and published pro-slavery histories based on their experiences overseas, both in the year 1793. Those histories are now viewed by scholars of the early modern period as valuable primary sources for the study of African and African diasporic history. In my work, I interpret these texts, that is, the origins of an archive, as emerging from a contingent process that involved three major influences in the writers' lives. The first influence that we need to account for is these men's early immersion in the metropolitan culture of letters and sciences within Britain. Edwards and Diels had very privileged upbringings. They were the eldest sons of Protestant property owners, both born within the borders of Great Britain and thus members of the petty gentry and national subjects, rather than disenfranchised foreigners or strangers. These facts matter, particularly as Britain was a patriarchal society, which placed tremendous value and expectations on firstborn sons, especially when their fathers died early, as was the case with both Edwards and Diels. By the time that they were born, England had been transformed by a process of common land enclosure over the past 2 centuries, and this made those who owned property part of an increasingly visible class of new elite who, while not part of the aristocracy or nobility, had privileged access to leisure, capital, and labor. As part of this class, Edwards and Diels were groomed to be gentlemen scholars from a young age. Diels was born in 1740 in the small village of Kirkliston in the county of Proslavery in central Scotland. Edwards was born 3 years later in the town of Westford in the county of Wiltshire in southwest England, both pictured here on this map. As young boys, since approximately the age of 11, they pursued schooling by local ministers who were hired to be their private tutors. And in addition to this class privilege, Edwards and Diels' youth in England testifies to their imperial orientations. Both of these men were raised in central hubs of the nation that owed its prominence to the development of its overseas empire. Edwards undertook his early education in Bristol during a time when it was still the metropolitan capital of the nation's transatlantic slave trade. He was sponsored by 2 of his uncles, who were among the wealthiest enslavers in the British Empire. Meanwhile, Diels undertook his education in central Scotland at a time when Edinburgh was Scotland's capital, the nucleus of the Scottish Enlightenment, and one of the most important centers of British imperial and intellectual culture. Edwards and Diels' early schooling immersed them in traditions of letters and sciences, helping them to develop a lifelong passion for reading, writing, and collecting. In a biographical sketch that he wrote shortly before his death, for example, Edwards recalled the importance of his early formative exposure to print culture. He recalls studying writing, arithmetic, orthography, and grammar, while being required to compose letters on a variety of subjects, including the benefits of good education and the mischief of idleness. The praise that he received, according to his own words, excited in his mind a spirit of emulation, cultivated in him a passion for books, and compelled him to search out travel writings on the Atlantic world at local print institutions, such as Bristol's Circulating Library. In 1759, the year before he went to Jamaica, Edwards moved to London to stay with his uncle, and here he lived in the midst of Fleet Street, a bustling neighborhood which had become, in just the last generation, the nucleus of Britain's printing revolution. He also lived next to the city's theater district, and so he could pass his time attending the most talked about performances in districts like Covent Garden. This early immersion in print culture was also accompanied by an early immersion in the culture of transatlantic science. After he finished his private tutoring, DL enrolled in Edinburgh's renowned medical school. Here he was taught about early modern traditions of collecting natural history specimens, also called botanizing. In addition to learning how to read and write, like Edwards, DL learned how to identify, harvest, store, and then transfer plants if they were suspected of having potentially beneficial medicinal properties. In popular guides for doctors, such as James Lynn's An Essay on the Most Effectual Means of Preserving the Health of Seamen, he read firsthand about how travelers used their experiences overseas to contribute to the production of scientific knowledge back at home. He was already practicing this tradition in the years immediately after he left the university. He was writing and mailing journals of his experiences to his family back at home, browsing booksellers and coffee houses in the greater London area, and studying writings of natural philosophy by well-known scientists like Robert Boyle. In 1762, the year before he traveled to Africa, he took the tour of the recently opened British Museum in Bloomsbury. In a letter to his brother, he expressed his profound amazement at the reach of British imperial science in the Atlantic world. So primed by their upbringings as gentlemen scholars, Edwards and DL learned to adapt their practice of letters and sciences to the context of racial slavery. Of course, Edwards and DL would have encountered people of African descent before they migrated overseas. There were perhaps 10,000 people of African descent living in London at the end of the 7 Years' War. As the nephew of two uncles who had West Indian plantations and who lived just outside of Bristol, one of the nation's busiest slave trading ports, Edwards would have come into contact with people of African descent as free and enslaved domestic servants. DL would have encountered them as sailors in the Royal Navy, where he worked for 2 years after graduating from medical school. And yet, migrating to West Africa and the West Indies was a transformative experience for Britain. It meant going from a white world, where Black people lived but were usually overlooked by whites, to an other world, where it was impossible to ignore the reality of Black demographic predominance. In Jamaica, in the year Edwards migrated, Blacks outnumbered whites by a ratio of 9-1. In Anamabo and Ouida, where DL lived in West Africa, this discrepancy was even greater, the white population of each town making up perhaps 1%. Edwards and DL both interpreted their migrations as an intellectual opportunity, pursuing what the historian Trevor Bernard has described as the Enlightenment in the tropics. Edwards lived at his uncle's estate, Greenwich Pen, on the outskirts of Kingston, the commercial core of the island, and here he was waited on by enslaved servants who rode him around in carriages, made and served his meals, carried his books, and laundered his clothes. He continued his studies by a private tutor named Isaac Teal, and the two of them wrote poetry together, using the Jamaican landscape as a source for their inspiration. As Edwards later phrased it, they wrote verses on local and temporary subjects, and then they published them in the island's newspapers. The beauty and novelty of the scene offered rich materials, and Edwards even began writing a West Indian Georgia poem in the style of James Granger's Sugar King. For his part, DL soon discovered that the British slave trading factories in West Africa were places where he could, as he phrased it, live genteelly. The governor in Anamabo Fort, where DL resided upon arrival, maintained a personal library, and Williams Fort at Ouida, where DL moved to serve as governor just a few years later, had officers' quarters that one contemporary visitor described as being lined with paper and pictures. DL was waited on by the so-called company or castle slaves at the factories, and they would have done all of the daily labor for him that enslaved servants were then doing for Edwards in Jamaica. In this context, DL embraced the role of an overseas informant and collector. For example, in a letter to his brother Andrew, who was then teaching at the prestigious University of Edinburgh, he wrote, "If anything from this country would be acceptable to your patron, your pupils, or yourself, I would send it with pleasure." But Edwards and DL soon discovered that the pursuit of letters and sciences in a slave society was not the same as it was back in the metropole. In the West Indies and West Africa, European letters and sciences conformed to a particular context of colonial and racial domination. This was especially important for Edwards and DL. Edwards had arrived in Jamaica just a few months before enslaved peoples launched Tacky's Revolt, the largest slave uprising in the British Caribbean during the 18th century. Led by people largely born in West Africa, the insurrection and its aftermath shocked the white community, particularly Edwards, as the revolt unfolded on some of his uncle's own estates in St. Mary's Parish, and he may even have mustered in a militia to help them suppress it. For Diels, he arrived in Anamabo and Ouida at a time when the British African Company was attempting to restart its operations there. The Fonte military had actually expelled the British from Anamabo a generation prior, and Ouida was under the control of the powerful kingdom of Dahomey. Both situations were delicate, and British power was fragile. We can see the ways in which Edwards and Diels adapted their pursuits of letters and sciences to the context of slave society by looking at two documents: a poem that Edwards wrote from Kingston in 1765, pictured here on the left, and a letter that Diels wrote from Anamabo in 1763, pictured here on the right. We'll start by looking at Edwards' poem and then move to Diels' letter. Edwards' poem was originally entitled The Negro's Dying Speech and dated to 1765, but you can see here its title was later changed to Stanzas Occasioned by the Death of Alico, an African Slave, and the date was changed to 1760, likely to draw on the popular recognition of Tacky's revolt which had occurred then. In the poem, Edwards ventriloquized the defiant, sensational final words that an African rebel from Jamaica delivered to his wife from atop the pyre in the moments before his execution by burning. Alico instructs his wife not to mourn his death, which he embraces as a form of freedom from Christian and pale tyrants, and as an opportunity for his soul to fly back to his native skies in West Africa. The poem was clearly influenced by Orinoco, a novella written in the late 17th century which had been adapted into one of the most staged plays in Britain during the 18th century, and which Edwards almost certainly saw in London in 1759, when a new version premiered at the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane. Like Alico, an enslaved West African prince named Orinoco is defiant as he faces execution in colonial Suriname for leading a slave revolt, accepting his death as a chance at freedom. However, Edwards also drew inspiration from a real-life event, a revolt that had actually taken place on Whitehall, one of his uncle's sugar estates in St. Mary's Parish in 1765. And there's just a map of the parish, and you can see Whitehall there on the right, and which Edwards had actually investigated as part of a special committee in the Jamaican Assembly. Looking at the committee's unpublished sources from that revolt, like the list of convicted persons shown on the lower right, we can see that the supposed leader was a West African man named Abruca. Just like the phonetically similar, yet entirely fictional, Alico, the real Abruca had been born in Africa, was married, and was burned at the stake. In other words, in his early poetry, we can see that Edwards is blending fiction and reality in ways that are almost indistinguishable. Diels' letter was written from his apartment in Anamabo Fort, pictured here on the right, just a few months after he arrived in West Africa. In the letter, he offers an ethnographic account of the Fonte people, or what he describes as a sketch of the manners of my Black neighbors. The letter was clearly modeled on a travel book called Accurate Description of the Ghanaian Gold, Tooth, and Slave Coast. That text, first written by a Dutch factor named Willem Bosman in 1704, and then printed in English the following year, was, by Diels' time, the most popular account in Britain of the so-called Gold Coast, or what is today Ghana. It was regularly used as a guide by new travelers to the region, and it was almost certainly one of the many books that Diels told his brother he purchased in London before leaving for Africa. Bosman had structured his text as a series of 22 letters, written to a close friend back at home. Now Diels wrote his own ethnographic letter to a close friend back at home. It mimicked Bosman's, not just covering all of the same subjects, but sometimes even copying its language, so that, for example, both writers explained the fetish oath, a legal practice that the Fonte used to determine people's guilt when they were accused of committing crimes, such as adultery or theft. Following in Bosman's footsteps, Diels made it clear that his ethnographic observations were useful to metropolitan readers back at home, whether they were imperial administrators or future migrants themselves. For example, at the end of his letter, he complained to his friend, "I think of the Blacks' disposition, nothing is worse than their ingratitude. They think it meritorious to cheat a white man all that lies in their power." Then he clarified that if we catch them stealing anything, we can exercise their own laws against them. By the time that British enslavers gathered at the London Tavern in February of 1788, preparing to equip themselves for the slave trade debates, Edwards and Diels had been writing about Africa and Africans for a quarter century. From the perspective of the anti-abolitionist lobby, they were the ideal candidates to advance the autoptic or eyewitness argument. In the final part of this presentation, we'll take a quick look at how they used their histories from 1793 to do that. Here we have the title pages from those two respective histories, the history of Dahomey on the right and the history of the British West Indies on the left. Already in these pages, Edwards and Diels clarified that they had personal relationships to the places they were writing about, and they even implied a link between those relationships and the authenticity of their histories. Edwards is identified beneath his name as being a resident of the island of Jamaica, while Diels is mentioned as being the governor of Cape Coast Castle, a post he had actually only just obtained. Meanwhile, the prominence of a standard phrase, authentic memoirs, printed on the title page of Diels' history, when it is read in the context of abolition, was making a political claim about the text's supposed authenticity. Inside the histories themselves, the authors wasted no time clarifying the relevance of their eyewitness position to the reader, like Norris, using prose and imagery. For example, Edwards surveyed prior writing on the history of the West Indies in his introduction, singling out authors like the Scottish historian William Robinson, who was not just anti-slavery, but was then compiling a history of the British colonies in the Americas, even though he had not traveled overseas. Edwards concluded the following: there is, however, this inconvenience attending the author who treats of local history and living matters, unless he himself visited the countries of which he writes, and had the benefit of actual experience and personal observation. Neither genius nor industry can at all times enable him to guard against the mistakes and misrepresentations of prejudiced, ignorant, or interested men. He is liable even to be misled by preceding authors who have undertaken on no better foundation than himself to compile histories. In contrast to these metropolitan compilers, who Edwards said were vulnerable to being deceived by the lies of prejudiced and interested men, Edwards announced that I have resided many years in the country of which I write, and as such, I am somewhat better qualified to judge on such things as the disposition, temper, and intellects of the inhabitants. In the portrait, which Edwards included in his history, shown here on the right, he reinforced this claim to his personal experience in the West Indies. The picture shows him standing in the parlor of his plantation great house in Trelawney Parish, northwest Jamaica. A view of his Caribbean context is in frame outside his window. Like Edwards, Diels also made claims about the relevance of his ties to the region he was writing about, not only dismissing compilers from the metropole, he also dismissed Africans or people of African descent who might turn historians. And here we can think specifically about Olaudah Equiano's popular slave narrative, which had appeared in print just 4 years earlier. Whatever may have been the importance of the Dahoman nation, Diels proclaims in his introduction, history affords no mark of it, previous to the conquest of the maritime kingdoms of Ardra and Ouidah between the years 1724 and 1727, as the blacks have no records, but those traditional ones, the legends of the bards, which are so politically effective that they are but little to be depended upon. It is from the whites resident amongst them, or those who have traded a long time with them, that the true history of any of these countries on this part of the coast can be obtained. Of course, when Diels wrote about the whites resident amongst them, and when Edwards wrote about authors who had actually resided in the colonies, what they meant in practice were white West Indian and white West African enslavers like themselves. Just as Edwards supported his claim to autoptic authority with a portrait of himself situated in the colonies, Diels included a series of images in his history that reinforced his point about the proximity of enslavers to supposedly authentic sources of African history. The engraving shown here, which was also used as the flyer for this talk, depicts a festival which was held annually at the royal port of Dahomey in its capital, Babylon. In this picture, we can see European enslavers, men like Diels, literally situated amongst the king and his people on a stage, as they dispense gifts to a crowd of Dahoman citizens. These figures were those whites resident amongst them, whom Diels referenced in his text. Having established their supposed legitimacy as sources of authentic information about the West Indies and West Africa, Edwards and Diels proceeded to make a variety of standard pro-slavery arguments in their books. They argued, as many had before them and as many would thereafter, that British enslavers were actually humanitarians who rescued Africans from a state of savagery in Africa by introducing them to the benefits of British civilization through the transatlantic slave trade. These self-serving arguments were already common in the empire. However, Edwards and Diels deployed them in strikingly novel ways. For example, in building upon the autoptic argument, they attributed these pro-slavery ideas not just to themselves as eyewitnesses, but to specific persons of African descent, to whom only they had access as a result of their privileged residencies overseas. In chapter 14 of his text, Diels inserted a speech that was allegedly delivered by King Kopinga of Dahomey after a British factor told him about a new law regulating the slave trade. In this speech, Kopinga directly refuted the ideas of abolitionists like Benezet. The following excerpt clearly shows why Diels wanted to print it. Your countrymen, therefore, who allege that we go to war for the purpose of supplying your ships with slaves are grossly mistaken. In the name of my ancestors and myself, I aver that no Dahoman man ever embarked in war merely for the sake of procuring wherewithal to purchase your commodities. I have, without thinking of the market, killed many thousands. If white men choose to remain at home and no longer visit this country, will black men cease to make war? I answer, by no means. And if there be no ships to receive their captives, what will become of them? I answer, for you, they will be put to death. In his history of the West Indian colonies, Edwards picked up this thread by attributing the same pro-slavery arguments to the enslaved laborers on his own sugar estates. He wrote that he had collected reliable intelligence by examining 25 young Africans newly arrived from various parts of the continent. He inserted descriptions for 9 of those interviews in the second volume of his text. In the one featured here, we get a sense for why he published them. Clara, a most faithful, well-disposed woman, who was brought from the Gold Coast to Jamaica the latter end of 1784, relates that she was born in a village near Anamabo, that her father and mother and their children, 9 in number, were slaves to a great man named Anamoa, on whose death they were sold to pay his debts, that 20 others were killed at his funeral. I asked her which country she liked best, Jamaica or Guinea. She replied, Jamaica was the better country, for the people were not killed there, as in Guinea at the funeral of their masters. And so Edwards is doing here with Clara and the West Indies what Diels was then doing with King Kopinga and West Africa. That is, he's ventriloquizing the voice of a particular person of African descent, and then inserting that voice into his published history so that it may operate as a form of pro-slavery testimony. In conclusion, this presentation has set out to historicize the creation of a particular textual archive, to trace the origins of an archive about Africa and Africans. Doing this work, I think, leads us to a valuable, if uncomfortable, conclusion about the intimate relationship between pro-slavery ideology and the history of letters and sciences and knowledge production in the early modern era. Early work on African history and ethnography in the Western world did not emerge inevitably, either as the result of historical momentum or as the product of a particular genre's established conventions. Rather, it emerged as the textual artifact of a far more specific process, one bound up with the contested politics of the transatlantic slave trade, and one in which enslavers played a leading role as historians and ethnographers. For 2 centuries, British enslavers had collaborated with metropolitan chroniclers and compilers to produce knowledge about the Atlantic world. As patriotic subjects of the same British Empire, these groups were bound together by their shared commitment to racial slavery and American colonization. It was in this context, during the 7 Years' War, that a new generation of Britons migrated to their empire's slave societies in the Atlantic world. Primed by their immersion in the metropolitan cultures of letters and sciences in their youth, this cohort first turned their attention to ethnographic writing years before the rise of an abolitionist movement, primarily as a way to understand the power and resistance of people of African descent in their lives. It was only when they returned home and found the abolition movement that they had a context for developing these observations into works of print. Abolition brought West Indian and West African enslavers together into a common model. It taught them to think about themselves as part of a singular class of British subjects. And most importantly, it taught them that they could no longer rely on inherited structures of knowledge production. They could no longer depend upon metropolitan compilers as their predecessors had done for over 2 centuries. In this way, abolition gave them a reason to think about their personal experiences overseas differently, as having a real value as published works. By developing and then deploying their autoptic or eyewitness experience in British slave societies, enslavers believed that they could out-argue their opponents in the abolitionist debates. In the process, however, they also bequeathed to us some of the first ethnographic and historical texts about peoples of African descent in the Atlantic world. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin. That was fantastic. We do have, again, I want to encourage anyone who has questions while a telephone is being answered behind me, to put them into the Q&A. Devin, let's start with one of the questions we have from an anonymous attendee. The question asks, your presentation suggests that Edwards and Dalziel wrote during an era marked by abolitionist sentiment and that their writing emerged from their pro-slavery leanings. How would you characterize enslavers writing about Africa or African descended people in the colonies from earlier periods? How does their writing differ in intent from the authors you focused on during your talk today? Was it not also pro-slavery?
Yeah, can you hear me? You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we can go back pretty far to find pro-slavery arguments. I mean, there was sort of a mirror of this debate early in the 16th century, and we see some of the same things with Sepulveda and Las Casas talking about Indians and indigenous people in the Americas. So some of these, I don't want to suggest that pro-slavery arguments were new during this time, but some of the things that we do see that are new, for example, is we look at Robert Norris's history and Diels' history. There's an attempt to write a civil history of a West African state that makes a chronicle of African kingdoms over time. That's new. As far as I know, there is no example of that prior to this period. The idea of incorporating individual Africans as voices of the pro-slavery movement into historical texts, that also, I think, is new. We look at Edwards' interviews that he conducted with enslaved people on his estates. To my knowledge, I'm not aware of any other person publishing interviews that they conducted with their own enslaved people on the questions of what their experience in Africa was like. So what I try to suggest at the end is that these people are not inventing pro-slavery arguments. The frameworks for pro-slavery narratives have been around for a long time, but the way that they're incorporating them into history and ethnography, there are some new things going on there that are important. And then also presage some of the frameworks that we have for those disciplines today too. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. Oh, sorry. I don't know if you might be muted or.
There I am. All right, I'm back. Your second question is from one of our shareholders, Ivan Jurin, who asks, did anti-abolitionists in the US South use their British white brothers as a model to counter the American abolitionism during the antebellum period?
Yeah, you're asking a question about the antebellum period, so I'm very out of my realm here to answer it. I think I've read some pro-slavery, there's a lot of books on pro-slavery ideology that look at what's going on in Britain as sort of a precursor to what goes on in the 1830s in the antebellum US, with I think Calhoun and the like, and some of the positive good narratives, slavery as a positive good. I'll say, I can't speak much to the antebellum era pro-slavery arguments. I'm not really aware, I'll say a couple things. I'm not really aware of many of those people making pro-slavery arguments in the US writing historical texts or ethnographic texts that are consciously trying to contribute to scientific traditions of history and ethnography. I'm not aware of those texts. The other thing I would say is that there is, I think, a difference in terms of that positive good school of thought, pro-slavery thought that emerges in antebellum America during the 1830s and the like, but there's a difference between that and what's going on with these British enslavers during the era of the 7 Years' War. All of these British enslavers claim they're very sentimental. They're steeped in sort of romantic tradition, and they all claim that they want the slave trade to end. They all claim that the slave trade is bad as they're defending it. So they never go as far as to say that it is the ideal way to structure the empire. They all kind of depict slavery as the evil necessity rather than making that ideological turn into saying that no, in fact, slavery is the right way to structure and order social relations. They don't usually go that far. Sorry, I can't be more specific on the antebellum era.
No, that's great, Devin. Thank you. We have another question from one of our shareholders, Carolyn Schimmel. Do you know of this welcome antidote to the sick mentality of your not Fab Five, John Stedman's narrative of a 5 years expedition against the revolted Negroes of Suriname in Guyana on the wild coast of South America from the year 1772 to 77. He fell in love with the local mulatta Joanna, who had nursed him back to health, and then it got complicated.
I don't know that much about Stedman's personal biography, but I have done some reading about him. So I'm looking at this question now about this story about him with Joanna. In the dissertation, I talk a little bit about enslavers' sexual relations with people of African descent, both in West Africa and the West Indies. Didn't really make it into this presentation, but there is some evidence of that, not quite as definitive as it is in Stedman's case. Enslavers kind of wanted to, they were very conscious about the way that they were perceived in public, and so they tried to sort of hide that aspect of their personal lives with enslaved people from print. But Stedman's an interesting case. If I recall, he has written, he's also fascinating because his book is like a very important primary source for the 18th century, very frequently used, and also appears in several editions over the course of his life. I know he wrote it in diaries, but then also has manuscript versions that are, I think, in Minnesota in the archives, and then also published versions. And as far as I'm aware, there's significant differences at each stage of that. And he complained, I think, that his editor made dramatic revisions to it that he didn't approve of. So he sounds like a very interesting case, but I didn't talk about Stedman for this project. He's a little later. I kind of wanted to cut the project off of the Revolutionary War in '73 when these guys kind of all dispersed. And I also wanted to talk about them as a group. I mean, I know I've done biographical analysis here, but what's interesting about all 5 of these people is that they all were part of a network. They all communicated with one another. They were all in the same room with one another at one time or another. And so I really wanted to look at them as a lobby, as making these works together. That's not to say that they didn't have their disagreements. They certainly did, right? And they had, I see them as, you know, slave traders and slave owners certainly had their disagreements. And part of that is like slave owners having this access to property and land in the West Indies, which slave traders didn't have. I think the former kind of saw themselves as a separate class. But I think abolition binds them together temporarily during this period. And it allows us to look at them as sort of taking part in a common project for these years. So Stedman would have been an interesting figure to look at, but I didn't look at him for that reason.
Well, that's we've actually, I believe, I'm not sure in this series, but I know that we have had some presenters talking about Stedman. It's a book that has gotten a lot of critical attention, I think, over the last, 5 years or so. But it's related, but out of the period. That all makes sense. Devin, if you don't mind, I wanted to ask a question that's a little bit related to the ones you've already answered. And that is, what's your sense of the reception of these books? Like, were you able to pick up anything either in the press or in parliamentary debate or in other sort of comments about how these books were received?
Well, yeah, a couple of important things about that. For one, the people who wrote them saw them as artifacts of a political debate. So we actually do have examples of them carrying their published histories into Parliament and using them, reading from them as actual texts. When all of these people who I've talked about today, they also testified as witnesses in the abolitionist debates. Actually, Edwards didn't testify in person, but the other 4 did. And they all brought their manuscript work with them to testify. So when Norris was writing his history of Dahomey, it was in manuscript when he testified. It wasn't yet printed yet. And he brought it and read from it. So they do see these things as being sources of their authority, right? Now, some of these writers succeed in transcending their identities as enslavers in the new era of abolitionist era of Britain and becoming celebrities. Edwards was actually the only one who was invited to join the Royal Society on the basis of his historical work. So he kind of managed to, even though what's fascinating about him is he was one of the most wealthiest slave owners in Jamaica. He probably had more enslaved people that he claimed ownership over than any other person in Jamaica, maybe even Simon Taylor. And yet he still managed to rise in the ranks of the scientific elite in Britain on the basis of his work, even though he never freed any of his enslaved people. In a time where many slave owners were criticized and being cast out of various circles. So some of them succeeded very well in the culture of letters and sciences, despite maintaining their pro-slavery stance until the end. But there was varying success for this. Some works are less known. The works on Africa are still less known today. than the works on the West Indies.
I'm curious too about like how these books, you know, how they place or weave together the individual, like the sort of first person accounts of what the enslavers experienced or how they ran their businesses, or with the broader history of the place. Like as you read them, do you get a sense of them being more like first person narratives, or are they more like a conventional history, or is it like, or are those the wrong genres to be thinking about?
What's different is we know from the early modern era that all of these genres that we today see as discrete were not discrete then, right? And especially during this period, the conventions of footnoting, the conventions of borrowing from sources are just coming into being and are not yet that formalized. So there are entire tracts of other people's texts that are just copied in there and not cited. And then at other times, there are things that are cited very heavily. Sometimes the books engage a lot with what we call historiography. And then other times it's really just first person impression. So Norris has a history. So Norris's history of Dahomey is actually half history, half ethnography. It's like there's a thing called the Memoirs, which is a biographical history of the reign of this king in the beginning. And that looks more like a civil history, which is like, here are the years of the administrations, here are the important things that have happened. But then the next part just goes into ethnography of this personal visit to this festival for half of the book. And the transition is just very, you know, pretty seamless. So you can see them moving in and out of these genres. They're not yet formalized.
That's really interesting.
And there's also, I should say, a lot of natural history. Anyone who works on the 18th century knows that a major genre at that time was natural history, right? And that is woven throughout all of these works as well. These authors are still trying to demonstrate their authority and those other disciplines at the same time that they're.
Yeah. I think we, if you don't mind, I think we have time for one final question. Thanks from anonymous attendee, but also asks, related to the conversation we were just having, if you have found evidence of abolitionists responding or shifting strategy to counter the slave traders' emphasis on autoptic evidence.
Yes, well, those of us who are familiar with African history and the narrative about African history will know that many of the abolitionists end up becoming the colonizers of the next generation of the African continent. And part of the way I think this argument can go is that they are learning from enslavers, that if they're going to be conversant in questions about Africa and questions about the slave trade, they need to have people on the ground in Africa. And you see a lot more interest in colonizers putting people on in abolitionists putting people on the ground in Africa. So, for example, Thomas Clarkson is sending his brother John Clarkson. They're also seeking out travelers who are going to Africa who can act in the same way that these enslavers are acting, but for their side of the debate. So abolitionists are definitely learning from this, and they're trying to get more authoritative sort of sources of Africa. They're trying to find the man on the spot, so to speak, who can represent their cause. The one other thing I'll say to that is what we might expect them to do that they don't do is they do not approach enslaved people and formerly enslaved people themselves and ask them to act as their witnesses or testimony. If we recall, Olaudah Equiano self-publishes his book, and Ottobah Kagwano's book is actually not reviewed by the abolitionist press very favorably. Black abolitionists could have been, I think, a very key argument for abolitionists to white abolitionists to work with. But we actually, it's my view that their ethnocentrism prevents them from using what would have been the greatest tool at their disposal.
Right. Well, Devin, thank you. It's a really very interesting talk. Again, I think, you know, it will send me to our stacks to see, you know, whether, you know, which I should have prepared for this, but I'm not sure which of those we actually have at the library company. I'm sure some. But again, it's a fascinating presentation, and I'm just grateful to you for sharing it with us. And I want to thank all of you who've tuned in again today for being with us and for listening to the presentation. Again, we will start up our fireside chats again in the new year. I hope you will
Thank you, Blanche. Puts it into the chat. The next Fireside Chat is on Thursday, February 17th. In the meantime, if you are looking for last-minute Christmas presents, you can buy someone a share in the library company or a membership in the library company. Still available, still suitable for gifting. I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday season, and I will look forward to seeing you in the new year, if not sooner. You can follow us on social media as you're seeing up in the chat. We'll eventually have a recording of this presentation available online with my gaffes edited out, I hope. And have a great night. I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael.